Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Leah Pelletier, Strategic Partnerships for Trillion Inc., and welcome to ProcureNXT. We've built a leadership series exclusively for the procurement community. These are designed to be peer-led sessions to help you engage, manage, and optimize your procurement strategies. It's my pleasure to introduce our CEO of Trillion Inc., Carolyn Joshua, a visionary leader in technology service industry. Carolyn has guided Trillion to become a trusted provider of global workforce solutions for numerous Fortune 500 companies. And I'm going to pass this over to Carolyn to introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you, Leah, for the intro. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm very happy today to introduce our speaker, Pratik Patel. With over 20 years of experience in procurement, Pratik has helped companies transform sourcing into a strategic driver of efficiency and innovation. He holds a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering and an MBA, bringing both technical expertise and business acumen to his work. Pratik has held key roles at Energizer and Mollencraft Pharmaceuticals. Currently at MasterCard, Pratik leads category strategy for labor, data, and AI. He also supports 7 divisions within technology sourcing. A lean and Six Sigma expert, he's passionate about eliminating inefficiencies and delivering smarter, faster, and more cost effective solutions. Pratik, welcome to ProcureNXT. We're thrilled to have you with us today and look forward to your valuable insights on one of the most talked about topics in the procurement community, pricing power. Today's session is titled The Lean Playbook for Pricing Power. Justify smarter, align better, win more value. With that, take it away, Pratik. We're looking forward to hearing your insights today.
Hey, Caroline, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I think this is a topic that everybody faces, which is price stability. And anything we can do to inspire people to help pay it forward in terms of some of the lessons I've learned in the 23 plus years in procurement, and really trying to bring it from a lean perspective, because I'm a big believer in lean. And I believe that if you utilize lean to really help you understand where the waste is, you will really drive towards optimization. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. If you think about lean, lean is all about flow. And that's what you want to establish in any process, is to have flow. And if you have any disruption of flow, that is considered waste. And waste is non-value added. So we want to be able to minimize waste in any process. And so lean principles really talks about understanding where the waste is, how do you eliminate that waste, and generate that flow. Because ultimately, if you can ensure that all of your tasks and everything that you're focused on is from a value-added perspective, then your customers are willing to pay for, and they will appreciate that value of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And so when we think about lean, we think about it more from a manufacturing perspective, but I'm hoping that for maybe that people that don't think about lean from a services standpoint will also see the value of what lean can bring from a services perspective about a topic that exists irrespective of anything that you buy from an external spend perspective, which is price stability. And so for this conversation, what I'd like to talk about is the 8 areas of waste that exist in any process. We call it downtime. When you think about these 8 areas of waste, it's called downtime. It's about the acronym downtime means defect, overproduction, waiting, non-utilized resources, transportation, inventory, motion, and extra processing. So I want to talk about each one of these from the lens of talking about price stability. And when I talk about price stability, ultimately what we want to achieve in any goods or service that we buy is to have stable pricing. And if you have stable pricing that works for your organization and works for that supplier and can be sustainable long term, then you're minimizing the waste. But as we all know, that does not naturally occur because there are forces that are outside of both the supplier's control and your organization's control that makes it difficult for you to have stable pricing. And so I want to go through each one of these areas of waste. And then from there, we can go through and talk through each one and talk about what it is, what is the waste. We'll talk about maybe mistakes I've made in the past as it relates to that waste component. And then what is the solution? And I welcome anybody that's listening to ask questions along the way. And at the end, I think we'll have more than enough time to be able to go through those. So let's go ahead and start with talking about the first one, defect. So when you think about a defect, it's about anything that you have to touch again due to not meeting the customer's need. So if that's the case, and we have a situation with price where if you have to have a price increase, you have to touch it again. If you have a situation where the supplier is saying that, hey, we're able to support your price right now, but at the same time, we have all of these challenges that prevents us from having that price be stable long term. Then you have a potential defect. And so you want to be able to address both of those situations. And what I've seen in my history is where pricing is not sustainable or the request for a price change exists, then that has an impact on budget. When you don't have a good process in how you go about to challenge and understand, then you do create a lot of iterations back and forth with the supplier. And when you do that, you cause a situation where it's not efficient. And so how do you make it efficient? Well, I think the first one on a defect is just know where the market competitiveness is for the price and challenge the supplier when they're asking for a price change of whether that price change is justifiable from where the competitiveness is in your ecosystem. So you have to understand where your ecosystem pricing is. And I say ecosystem because each and every company would have a level of price competitiveness that exists that you've built by creating this competitive tension with your supply base so that you always have an idea of like what is competitive in your company. There's a competitiveness from an industry perspective, and then there's a competitiveness within the company. And so I hope that from a defect perspective, knowing where the market competitiveness is a key component of that. So overproduction. So overproduction is when you're producing more than what is required. And think about this in terms of when a supplier comes back with a price increase, and you really struggle with the justification for that price increase. They're going to try to give you the standard language about inflation or supply and demand or even foreign currency is what's driving these increases. And that doesn't really get to the root cause of why they need that increase. That could be a symptom, but it's a symptom that can be managed based on how well they manage their internal cost as well. And so it's important from a lean standpoint, when we think about overproduction, is really getting down to identifying the root cause. What is the true cause of that increase? And so we need to enable where you are able to challenge the supplier and where the supplier is really able to show what is that root cause. Because if you don't get to the root cause, you potentially are not going to be able to solve what is causing that price risk as well, because they might come back 6 months later with another increase. And so it's important that you understand what's being done to address the increase, to mitigate it in the future. And that's really what I look at from an overproduction standpoint. Any comments or thoughts on that, Caroline?
Yes. We actually have a question from the audience, Pratik. So what if a supplier says we have no choice, we have to implement a price increase or we will not survive?
Yeah. So that is something that I think you have to think about this in terms of then, are they a going concern? Is there a financial risk with that supplier that you need to materially be concerned about? And that's where I usually start challenging when a supplier says that, okay, then does that mean that your cash flow is being impacted? Does that mean that you are being challenged with paying your bills on a timely manner? Help me understand when you say we will not survive. Are you giving us pricing that is below your cost? And if that's the case, why are you doing that? How long have you been doing that? What are we going to do so that you can be financially viable? Because we need you to make a profit. This is part of your, I guess, an obligation you have to your shareholders and to us as a customer to ensure business continuity.
Yes, that's a great point. And we actually have 2 more questions from the audience if you'd like to take them now.
I'm fine with that.
So from Kenny, why is overproduction considered a significant waste in lean, and what are its downstream effects on resource costs?
Yeah, so overproduction means that, so you think about it from a services perspective, overproduction is going to be on the communication and what is being communicated to you. And if what is being communicated to you is not getting to a root cause, then you're having to do a lot of iterations back and forth to try to get down to what is the true problem. And so it's important from a procurement lens perspective to coach the supplier so that that supplier understands that, help me understand, I'm trying to understand why you need the increase, but I'm not really seeing the main driver. And when you say it's inflation related, or when you say it's due to a foreign exchange, that is a macro factor. That does not necessarily mean that you are facing that challenge yourself, because you may have mitigated some of that risk. And if you haven't, you need to be able to tell us what specifically about that component of price is impacting the reason for the increase. Because foreign exchange, it might just be a part of that cost is actually leaving that country, and that's where the impact is for the foreign exchange. So that's where it's important. It's getting down to the root cause. And from a resource perspective, it's the utilization of those resources to try to get to that root cause, because otherwise you have lots of meetings and you're still not getting to really what is driving it. So I hope that helps answer that question.
We have one more question, and it is, what specific methods can we use to identify true cost drivers versus surface level inflation claims? But that's a hot topic right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Because ultimately it's about value. So this is a simple diagram that anytime a supplier comes back with any type of increase that I've shared for many, many years. And so you have to think about that balance. So the balance component is there's the element of value, which is what we receive as the customer, and then there's the cost. So the value should always weigh more than the cost. And if that is the case, then you're able to balance where it's justifiable for the cost because you're getting the value. And value is all the savings that they're providing, the investments that they're bringing, the productivity and efficiency that they're helping to drive in your program. And so if that is being disrupted, then you have to understand what forces are within their control of the supplier and what forces are outside of their control. And the forces that are in their control, which is their internal cost of how they manage their overall cost to serve, that what are they doing to mitigate any increases that they cannot control through those internal costs? Because if they're able to manage their costs more effectively, then those costs the costs that they cannot control, they're able to mitigate a lot of that. And that's how the approach I would take, and really challenge the supplier in terms of how are you managing your own cost so that you're not passing on just any cost that you're facing from a macro force standpoint. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. Thank you for those questions, and please continue. Love to have the questions. Hopefully we drive a greater awareness and hopefully create an environment to build more price stability. But let's talk about waiting. Waiting is the next one in that downtime acronym, right? And from a waiting standpoint, we talk about waiting as a time delay when expecting something to happen. So like when you think about it from a price stability perspective, not accepting increases when increase is justifiable. So I'm sure many people on this call do that because what is it that your leadership always says? We have to hold price. We cannot have price increase. You got to push back on them and say, we can't accept this. Well, guess what that's going to happen? Over time, that's going to create even a more impactful, impact. It's going to have a bigger impact on the supplier in terms of when they are forced to provide a price increase. It's going to be much larger than what it was originally. And so you have to think about what's that cost to you. If you got like a 20% increase in cost versus a 5%, but how you try to mitigate that is you set the expectations up front. You say no surprises. So when they do face the risk, you need to know ahead of time on what those potential risks are so you have a chance to mitigate those. You have a chance to come up with a plan on whatever those cost drivers are that is causing them to say like, hey, we might have to increase cost in the next 6 months. Well, let's address it. Let's understand what's driving that cost and what can we do on our side to be able to mitigate that. Maybe it's an issue of we're overspecified around what that service is or what that good is that we're purchasing. And do we really need to have the level of specification that we do have? For example, on the services side, it could be the maintenance plans that you have in place. How many tickets are you actually seeing? Do you really need to have the Cadillac? Can you have a Ford, instead of a Cadillac in terms of the plan? So I think that's one of the things that you can do is set those expectations, mitigate that risk by understanding what are those pressures on cost and collaboratively working together upfront. All right, let's go on to the next one then. So if you think about the next waste, non-utilized people. So it's people skills, abilities, knowledge, not effectively or appropriately being used, right? That's what the definition is. So if you don't have an increase, does that mean the same resource support for multiple years? So that's the example I would use as it relates to services. Because here's the problem. Our businesses get comfortable with the resources that are supporting them. And we have to recognize that we're paying for a job role, a job level, and a job description, ultimately, for what those resources are doing. But over time, those resources are building competencies that probably justify them being at a higher level, but we don't have the budget. So we want to continue to utilize those resources. And when we do that, you're bringing on some risk of potential attrition because they're going to feel like, hey, they're not growing and they need to continue to develop for themselves. And they may want to move on to another role, right? You may face a situation where from the business standpoint, there's a level of complacency when it comes to that resources and what they're delivering. And they don't ever think about those resources leaving. Well, the supplier has to build a succession plan. That is a responsibility the supplier has. And businesses, if they know well in advance that, hey, these resources, their competencies have developed further, they're more valuable, but we can't keep paying them the same rate, but yet we don't have the budget to increase their price, then business has to understand there could be an alternative resource that will need to take over that work. But the benefit is you have a reverse shadowing, approach that you can take so that existing resource and their legacy knowledge can still be utilized in that situation. But price increase on services I've seen is because in some cases we keep the price the same and want the same resources. I totally get keeping the price the same because that's where the market competitiveness is. But expecting to have the same resources, I think that is an unreasonable expectation. And so having succession planning, I think, would be the solution, and kind of being proactive in trying to manage that risk.
So we have another question. Is that okay now?
Absolutely, always.
Okay. All right. In terms of lean principles, how do we ensure that employees are continuously adding value without being stuck in non-productive activities? And how do you think they can engage in more value-driven roles?
Complacency is something that I think naturally occurs when you have repetition. And in your roles, I think that that is absolutely something that you have to be aware of. So from a lean standpoint, I think when you think about value add, you have to think about like it's like a mini Kaizen in a sense, right? So it's continuous improvement where you are constantly thinking about what can you do that adds a little bit more efficiency or productivity to your daily task. And so you want to be able to enrich a culture where that is something that everybody needs to be constantly thinking about. And if you make that as part of your culture, like, hey, what can we do a little better than what we're doing today? What could that look like? At Energizer, at one point on a weekly basis, we had to go into this database and input what new things have we learned, or what new components could we see that have driving better efficiency or productivity for us. And it was amazing and powerful because this database was available for everybody. So then you could also kind of get ideas from that. And what can you do to make your job a little bit more efficient, a little bit more productive? And so I would encourage people in terms of instilling lean and having a culture of it is to think about that and put that expectation on your people so that there's this continuous drive for improvement around what we're doing. And you're constantly thinking about where can you drive greater productivity, greater efficiency. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Wondering how are AI and data analytics reshaping procurement strategy in pricing?
So I think that's a little bit different than this topic, but we can definitely talk about it, at least to give a perspective on this, right? I think when you think about data and AI, first of all, data should always be a part of any procurement strategy. You need data to help tell the story. And so data should always be an enabler of that. And if you don't have good data, you need to find out what is causing you from not having good data. And I would almost encourage you to do what we call a value stream mapping exercise in Lean, where you try to kind of understand what is it that you're trying to achieve and where is that current process, and mapping out that current process, understanding where the waste exists, what type of data exists, what is the maybe the discrepancy or variability that you have in your data, and then build a future state where you're able to minimize that variability, to create that good data, because you need that. Because once you have good data, now you can leverage machine learning and AI in terms of potentially gleaning insights from that data. And I think from a procurement perspective, leveraging structured data towards being able to glean that insights from an AI perspective, I think that's great. We should do more and more of that, have more use cases of that. When you're leveraging unstructured data, just be careful. There's biases in the data, there's hallucinations, and it should be used as a tool, never as kind of a final end-all, do-all of what you're trying to accomplish of a task that you're doing today, and then having the AI do it. So it's helping us in being able to get better insights. I would say that's what the AI is doing. And from a data perspective, we should always look to strive to have good data. So we have 4 more ways to talk about. So unnecessary movement. So that's what transportation is. And when you think about that, yeah, that's easy to see in a manufacturing environment, but what would that look like from a services perspective? So in this conversation around price stability, I look at it as not having a template that captures a price impact or price change. And so transportation to me is about where you have a price change and you have many different stakeholders that are going to be involved. And maybe you address one or two of those stakeholders in your communication around the price change, but then others come in and chime in and say, well, how does it impact this? Or what about these POs? Or what's the impact from a P&L perspective versus budget standpoint? I mean, there's a variety of questions that can come in. And so what we have done is we have basically created it so we call this price change template. So the supplier will go in anytime that they have a need for a price change. And for us, there's also a 6-month notification period for any price change within our ecosystem. But they will go in, they will capture the relevant data that we're asking them to fill in the blanks around. And then we've created additional tabs within the spreadsheet that capture for different stakeholders what they would require, what finance would require, for example, what sourcing requires, what our MSP requires because they manage the price changes in our VMS, for example. All of those are being captured so that, and whatever the supplier has input, wherever it's not redundant information, they have to input in those other templates, and we have it highlighted in yellow as to what they need to. And otherwise, that data is automatically fed from the data that they've already shared, and that's worked out great for us. So one time we're communicating and all the different stakeholders are getting what they need, and we're minimizing the transportation of information in a sense in order to get what we need to have accomplished to really understand the impact of that price change. So inventory. When you think about inventory, this is the definition is about common result of multitasking, unbalanced workloads built up over time. So that's how I would kind of define it. And I'm trying to look at it from the lens of services and how you think about it, not in terms of inventory being goods as well. And build up of having more and more stock of inventory. So this is a different lens of how to think about inventory. And so price stability, when you look at it that way, not keeping up with the drivers of cost, or how the macro, micro factors are impacting the costs. Trying to make it work when other cost structure is more competitive. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, right? So the first piece, not keeping up with the drivers of cost. That's shame on us. From a procurement lens standpoint, we should always understand what is driving cost and ensuring that that cost is sustainable. I absolutely go to my supply base. My supply base knows that when they propose cost that I don't think is sustainable, I challenge them and I tell them, I need you to confirm for me that what you're sharing here is truly sustainable because this is more competitive than what we have seen. And if it is truly something that you can sustain, then we want to be able to capitalize on that and more of our businesses to be able to utilize it. But if it's not sustainable, then we really need to be able to talk about what is it that you can do to have a more sustainable cost. Because once you establish that cost becomes a part of the run rate. And if it becomes a part of that run rate from a budget standpoint, and then you have to go and increase cost again, that makes it so much harder. So I don't want us to have a lowball cost in our ecosystem that then we have to go in and justify having a budget for increasing the cost. That's waste. So to minimize that, I think we need to proactively understand and work collaboratively together to address the focus on the value. And if there is components that are not sustainable, but others are sustainable, then the not sustainable, you have to question, is it really value added? Are our customers willing to pay for it? And so I would challenge that we should look at it from that angle and also align where if it's not sustainable, the current price, then maybe we're not the right supplier for them if it is sustainable in our ecosystem, but not for that supplier. And so align on a ramp down plan. We all have to understand this is business. And sometimes in business, it doesn't always work out. And that's okay, because the supplier is successful for a reason for what they do, but it may not fit in your ecosystem. Hopefully that helps with understanding inventory.
Yes, absolutely, Pratik. So I was just wondering, how do macro and microeconomic factors affect or impact inventory cost structures, and what strategies can procurement professionals use?
Yeah, so this is about that buildup component too, because when you think about the macro factors being inflation, I think that cost like cola is something that I have seen many times, and that's going to get into the motion waste in a second as well. But just to talk about cola for a second, the cost of living adjustments, and they'll be in the contract. Maybe sometimes suppliers will say, "Hey, I got to give merit increases to my people." And the cost of the same market basket that we had last year and what it cost this year is so much higher. So we need to ensure that we capture that increase and pass that on. And to a certain extent, I get it, but at the same time, what are you doing to mitigate your cost? So those macro factor components, in services, I don't usually have a COLA term in there, because it's about our ecosystem and your competitiveness in our ecosystem. And you as a supplier have to be able to continuously look at how you're proactively managing your cost and mitigate your cost. And if COLA is a driver, then that tells me that there's maybe not the level of maturity that I would expect on how you're mitigating your cost. And so that's a component from a macro perspective. From a micro perspective, that's getting specifically into our ecosystem. And so in our ecosystem, like we talked about earlier, when you think about it from resources and having the same resources for multiple years, we have to understand, and I always educate our business on this too, that when we have the same resources for multiple years, that is ultimately going to have an impact on the price stability. And so we have to proactively kind of look at that too, in that, hey, supplier, these resources have been supporting me for 2 or 3 years now. What are we going to do? What's our plan with that? How are we going to be looking at alternatives that will help us to, alternatives meaning alternative resources that we can help to kind of still have the level of competency we need for the work that those resources are doing, but not face the attrition risk that will probably exist the more and more you use them, because they're going to get to a point where they're not getting the merit increases at their supplier either, because they're not able to pass that on with their cost structure. So hopefully that helps from a macro and micro standpoint. All right, let's talk about motion. So looking at motion, work without producing a value-added activity. So we think about this in terms of meetings, follow-ups, trying to track down information, using the whole analogy of, just going through the motions. And that's not something that you want to do, because that has a component of complacency associated with it too. And so what I would share there as it relates to price stability is about accepting macro factors such as inflation, foreign exchange that we've talked about, supply demand, to justify an increase. Never do that, please. Because those macro factors, while they are there, you truly need to understand what is driving your cost with that supplier. And is that supplier competitive in your ecosystem? Because sales guys are going to be pressured to continually want to increase price year over year and use whatever, tools they have available to them to be able to do that. And if one of those tools that they've always utilized is, hey, what's going on in the economy, and using that as a means, then they're going to be, you as a procurement professional, I think, need to challenge that piece. And so that value scale, I think, will help in terms of ensuring that you don't just accept what they're sharing, but really get down to how is it impacting your cost and what are they doing to mitigate their cost. All right, let's talk about the last one then. Excess processing. I look at this in terms of creating multiple versions of a piece of work. I'm sure you've all experienced that in some way or another. And in this situation, I would talk about it about not allowing enough time to process the increase, enabling many levers to be able to pull to mitigate the increase too. You need to be able to allow time for this. And suppliers are always going to pressure and say, I got to have this increase before the end of quarter, or I need this in the next 2 months. Well, like I said, in our program, we have a notification period, and that's 6 months. And it's a take it. I mean, it's basically mandatory. If you want to be in a part of on our program, and you're providing any type of rate structure as a part of that, there's a 6-month notification period. All suppliers know this. All suppliers understand this. This helps to ensure that they provide the risk ahead of time for any price stability that we might have. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of the 8 areas of waste and price stability. And hopefully I was able to provide some nuggets that help people in terms of how to try to ensure you maintain price stability.
That was a great topic. Thank you so much, Pratik. I know we have a few questions that came in from the audience, so I wanted to get to those. Just trying to see which one was next. All right. So Jeremy wants to know, how would you approach a scenario where a company pricing to the point where it makes more business sense for a majority of your vendors to support another company that is more flexible on pricing? And what steps do you take to strike the right balance between price and quality?
So let's talk about that. Approach a scenario where a company optimizes that pricing to the point where it makes more sense for a majority of your vendors to support another company that has a flexible pricing. Okay, so I guess I'm a little confused by the way that the question is being asked, in that so I want to make sure that I understand it properly. So more sense for a majority of your vendors to support another company that has flexible pricing. So I'm assuming that the question is about, all right, you have many suppliers in your ecosystem, and you want to optimize the pricing among those suppliers, but you want to ensure you have a level of flexibility for those suppliers to provide their various cost structures because of the value that they provide too. So I'm assuming that's where it's talking about. So you have different types of cost structures, and how do you still optimize price where you have maybe higher price suppliers and lower price suppliers, and where to utilize the two? Would that be a correct way to look at this, Leah, from your mind, or do we want to
Yeah,
ask Jeremy?
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. So if I look at it that way, you have to look at the capability of that supplier. And also, how does that supplier fit in from a segmentation perspective? Are they, if you're familiar with the 4-quadrant approach around segmentation, where you have buyer influence and seller influence on the y-axis, buyer influence on the x-axis, and you have like a commodity, leverage, custom, strategic. Like those are kind of common. There's some like differences in terms of the name terminology, but custom suppliers are where usually we would bucket a lot of those higher cost suppliers, because it's not BAU activities. They're creating or enabling. So optimizing price when it comes to the higher cost suppliers is about where are they creating or enabling for you versus just supporting activities that is just an augmentation of what they're doing for you too. Like sprint teams on development, majority of that work is going to be what I call BAU. And so that's going to be where you want to optimize your cost based on the value for money, and that you see that value based on the cost structure. So we do find in our ecosystem, there's less and less variability when it comes to the leverage category or the leverage segmentation, because suppliers understand what does it mean to be competitive in our ecosystem, and they want to be competitive in our ecosystem. Whereas a custom supplier, there's a lot more variability. And that's where you have to really only utilize them for specific situations for where you believe they are justifiable for that increase. I hope that helps answer that question.
It does. And then the second piece to it is, what steps do you take to strike the right balance between price and quality?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we're actually evolving on right now, because I think regression analysis is one of a great tool to be able to utilize that isolates price with other variables. And so if you have good data and you use regression analysis, you'll be able to have a deeper understanding of where that quality component comes in. But it's how do you then measure the quality? That's the component too, because you need to be able to measure it to be able to know, okay, at what quality attributes justifies the higher price versus what quality attributes doesn't really justify having any more higher cost than anyone else. And that's where you really have to be able to look at. You have to be able to define those quality metrics that you look at and value, and then be able to see how does your supply base kind of compare to those metrics, and what is that pricing structure for that. But where we're going, like I said, is to build out a regression analysis model that will enable us to be able to see that, hey, even though we're paying a higher price for this supplier, the quality metrics do show that they're providing greater output. They're providing greater productivity. And so it is justifiable to pay more than for that supplier, because when you put that on a level playing field, you'll actually see that on that line from a regression perspective, it's right there. It's just as competitive as what others are when you're able to kind of create that view.
That's very interesting. I'm learning a lot. Regression analysis to keep that in my top of mind. What Jeremy mentioned regarding your remarks is, yes, we've seen this happen before, where our supplier began supporting a competitor because the other company had much higher rates that we could not compete with. And as a result, the hiring managers were not getting the quality candidates they needed, if any at all, because all the candidates were being presented by the other company.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you for that clarification. So on that piece, right? Because you always want to have the A players on your supporting your company. And if you start to see that quality goes down because of price, you always have to have alternative suppliers. You've got to create that competitive tension in your ecosystem. So there has to be other suppliers that can compete for that and provide a similar level of quality, so that that does not become a component where you're forced to increase, like to accept an increase in price. So that's on the sourcing side from a category management perspective, in terms of the supply base that you qualify, the supply base that you've assessed, and that they're just as capable as the other suppliers, which are taking your A players and giving them to your competitors. Because I joke when I go to these conferences, and I do tell people, not from a perspective of being brash about it, but being sincere, that, hey, I want to thank you for helping to subsidize my cost. Because in our ecosystem, we don't have increases very often. And I have no doubt that suppliers still face the pressure, but they're getting those increases from other customers.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. I know we have a few more questions. I think we've addressed the majority of them. There was one that came through when we were talking about inventory, and it was, what steps can we take to reduce the time goods spend in transit or at various stages of the supply chain, cutting down on waiting time and idle periods?
Yeah, so this one is really talking about from a goods perspective, right? So when you think about this from a goods standpoint, you really have to understand what is that, like breaking it down, like what all of those components are that takes up that lead time, and then looking at doing a value stream mapping and identifying where that waste is, so that you're able to really understand what is driving that time and can that time be reduced. Part of this has to be in terms of probably forecasting as a component of that. But the transit time, to a certain extent, unless you're willing to pay more from like air shipping versus boat, you are going to face that. That's the reality. You're not going to speed up the boats.
Yeah.
So the container ships. And so I don't really know what you can do. So there are components that are uncontrollable on the transit time. And then there are components that are controllable, which is maybe inventory that you have to keep because it's worth it to you, because of if it's going to have an impact on the next steps downstream. For production, for example, you might need those raw materials. And if you don't have those raw materials, then that's going to impact your production. So you might be willing to have more inventory for that reason. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, that's great. And the next one is related to technology. So I think this ties in really well. What emerging technologies can procurement professionals leverage to create competitive price advantages?
Yeah, definitely. ChatGPT doesn't hurt, because it will give you some perspective. When it comes to just asking the question about, it's not going to give you like specifics. It's not going to tell you exactly what the price is, but it's going to tell you about competitiveness of the suppliers. Like, for example, if you say a big four company and then you ask it related to traditional India IT services company and how are their costs going to compare, it's going to be honest about it. It's going to share some insights for you. So I think leveraging tools like Copilot, ChatGPT, that doesn't hurt. But in terms of emerging technologies that professionals can utilize, I think market intelligence as well. There's a lot of third-party companies out there that will give you that market intelligence, and benchmarking is something that should be looked at. Besides that, I would also share there isn't really emerging technologies, but you should be building a rate card library in your ecosystem. We have a fairly extensive rate card library, and that rate card library is based on job role, job level, and job description. And the job description that we've built in our ecosystem allows us to have 70% of our spend that's on time and material to be in 10 job role, job level combinations right now, because we've made that so robust that the business wants to use it. And so apples to apples on rates is very important to really understand from a pricing perspective. And we've been able to do that, again, using lean principles of standard work. Standard work says that when you establish your process, you're establishing it with consistency. Then there's a level of normalization that takes place in our job roles. How we define a software engineer and the levels that we have is consistent and has been for 4+ years in our ecosystem. And that's what enables us, to be able to look at that competitively. And I would say that is more important than any technology, is having good standard rate cards that will last forever.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any best in class principles or practices around benchmarking? I know benchmarking is always a tricky process, and we have a question that ties into that also. How do you establish price benchmarks within specific procurement categories?
Yeah, so when you talk about benchmarking, the one component that's always going to be there is your internal. So whatever you have already in your ecosystem that you're buying from your various suppliers, and ensuring you have the proper system in place. In our case, it's the VMS, right? That's our system. But we also have our rate card library, which we actually integrated with our MSP so that we have a workflow for our rate cards. So anytime we have any change in our rate cards, this is also another lean activity, I would say, so that you don't have multiple versions of your rate card as well as you have different rates inputted, is you have one center source, one source of truth, that anytime you have a change in rate or you have new rates, you're always putting it in the same place, and it's consistent in how you're being and looking at that rate from a job description perspective. But the other thing from a benchmarking perspective is you you would probably have to pay a little bit, I would think, to get more specific to your ecosystem that somebody can benchmark. Because if you're going to use like the Gartners of the world, they're going to be very high level industry benchmarks. And for the most part, and I've told the Gartner this, it doesn't help us because our ecosystem is in a different, I guess, competitiveness than how Gartner's viewing overall industry. So looking at overall industry, not a good benchmark in my mind. You have to look at it for how does it fit with your ecosystem and your specific area.
I love that. And I definitely agree. And Bo from the audience said the internal rate card library methodology is inspiring. So I think that's a great point. Go to your internal. Don't try to compare, apples and oranges. So this has been a really great conversation, Pratik. We appreciate you. Very insightful. And I think that we're almost to the end. So we're going to wrap it up with just a thank you to Pratik. We thank all of our audience members for joining us today. We have a next session coming up on July 9th. That's actually a Wednesday, and it'll be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. This one's going to be really exciting too. It'll be interactive and live in person. So wait for the details, and we hope to see you on our next webinar session. Thanks again, Pratik.
Thank you, Leah, for leading the discussion. And thank you, Pratik, for a very insightful and thought-provoking session. And I've heard you speak at several conferences, so I've had the privilege of firsthand listening to you before. But for our audience today, I think your practical strategies around lean thinking and pricing power, I think, gave us a lot to reflect on. And more importantly, hopefully we'll act on it. So thank you again. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for being a part of ProcureNXT. We really hope that this discussion inspires you to rethink how procurement can drive smarter justification, stronger alignment, and greater value for your organization. So thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And until next time, network, excel, and transform. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye.